It was just another quiet morning in a small town, but for Jamie, the day was about to take a turn she would never forget. Sitting at a corner booth in the diner she'd been visiting for years, she sipped her coffee, unaware that trouble was already heading her way. The clinking of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the warmth of the familiar setting seemed like the perfect place for a peaceful breakfast. But in the background, a group of bikers had just entered the diner, their heavy boots thudding on the floor as they made their way to the counter. Jamie didn't think much of them at first. After all, the diner had always been a place where people came together, strangers and friends alike. But these bikers weren't just any group. They had a reputation, and it wasn't one that was built on good intentions. They were known for being ruthless, intimidating, and often causing trouble wherever they went. Still, Jamie went about her meal, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. What Jamie didn't know was that the bikers were eyeing her, or more specifically, her connection to someone they hated. She was the daughter of a blind war veteran, a man who had served his country with pride and honor, but was now living a quiet life in a nearby care home. The bikers had a score to settle with him, a past full of anger, betrayal, and bitterness that had never been forgotten. And now, it seemed, they were going to make his daughter pay. As Jamie sat there, trying to enjoy her eggs and toast, she began to feel uneasy. The bikers' glances weren't just casual, they were intense, focused, as if they were waiting for something to happen. It wasn't long before they made their move. The leader of the gang, a towering figure with tattoos covering his arms and a scar running down his cheek, approached Jamie's table. His eyes locked with hers, and the air in the diner seemed to grow heavier. "Excuse me, sweetheart," he said in a voice that oozed with menace. "You're the daughter of that old veteran, aren't you?" Jamie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how they knew, but there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. The room grew tense as Jamie tried to stay calm. She wasn't about to let anyone intimidate her, especially not these thugs. But the leader wasn't done. He leaned closer, his breath hot on her face. "You tell your father we're coming for him. It's only a matter of time before we take care of him, and you." Fear gripped Jamie's chest, but she wasn't going to let them see how scared she was. She sat up straighter, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she tried to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice low but firm. "But you better leave now, before things get worse." The biker's smirk grew wider, as though he was enjoying the fear he saw in her eyes. Just as he was about to say something else, Jamie's phone vibrated in her pocket. She quickly pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she saw the caller ID. It was her father's care home. Without thinking, she answered the call. "Hello?" But the voice on the other end was not one she expected. It was the head nurse, and she sounded panicked. "Jamie, you need to get here now. There's been an incident with your father. You need to come quickly." Jamie's stomach dropped. Her heart raced. The bikers were still looming over her, sensing her shift in focus. Her hand tightened around the phone as she struggled to keep her composure. "Is he okay?" Jamie asked, her voice shaking. I don't know," the nurse replied, her voice trembling as well. "But something's wrong. He's asking for you." Jamie's mind raced, but she couldn't help feeling a cold chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever was happening at the care home was connected to the bikers, to the history that they had with her father. They were not done with her, or with him. The tension in the diner was unbearable now. The biker's grin never left his face as he watched Jamie's hand shake. But then something unexpected happened. Jamie made a decision. She knew she had to act fast. Whatever was going on with her father wasn't just a coincidence, and she had a feeling the bikers had something to do with it. She didn't hesitate. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice cold, a new resolve hardening inside of her. The biker stepped back, surprised by her sudden defiance. Jamie didn't give him a second glance as she dialed a number into her phone. Her fingers were steady now, her heart racing but her mind clear. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, steady, a voice Jamie trusted more than anything. "I need you," she said quickly, her voice urgent. "It's happening. I need help. Now." The bikers were watching her every move, but there was nothing they could do to stop her. Jamie's phone call was the last thing they expected. She had made her move. And now, the wheels of something much bigger were set in motion. But as Jamie stood there, waiting for the response on the other end, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her father anymore. The bikers weren't just trying to intimidate her. There was something darker, something more dangerous at play. And she was right in the middle of it. Would help arrive in time? Would Jamie be able to protect her father, and herself, from the bikers' wrath? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? The clock was ticking, and Jamie had no idea what would happen next. The seconds stretched on like hours as Jamie stood frozen in the diner, her hand clutching the phone, heart pounding in her chest. The bikers, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, slowly began to close in around her. Their presence grew heavier, more menacing, as though they were anticipating her next move, and waiting for her to falter. The leader, still standing a few steps away, crossed his arms and let out a low chuckle, clearly amused by her defiance. "You think you can just call for help and make us go away?" he sneered, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You're not gonna escape this, sweetheart. Not now." But Jamie didn't back down. She couldn't afford to. Not now, not when her father was in danger. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her thoughts racing as she waited for the person on the other end of the line to respond. Each passing moment felt like an eternity. Come on," she muttered under her breath, barely aware of the danger looming over her. Then, the voice she'd been waiting for finally came through the line, cutting through the tension in the air like a lifeline. "Jamie? It's Ben. What's going on?" Ben was more than just a close friend, he was an ally. He had served alongside her father during the war, and since then, the two men had shared a bond that had only deepened over time. When Jamie needed help, Ben was the first person she called. And right now, with her father's life on the line, she needed him more than ever. "It's the bikers, Ben," Jamie whispered urgently. "They're here, at the diner. They're after Dad. Something's happening at the care home, and I don't know what, but it's not good. I need you to get to him, now." Ben's voice was steady, calm, but Jamie could hear the edge of concern beneath it. "I'm on my way," he said without hesitation. "Stay put. I'll take care of it." Jamie let out a sigh of relief, though the fear still gnawed at her. She knew Ben wouldn't let her down, but there was a part of her that couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her gut. These bikers weren't just any criminals. They had a history with her father, one that had been simmering for years, and it was clear they weren't finished with him, or with her. Whatever had happened at the care home, it was connected to the threat she now faced in the diner. The biker leader took a step forward, his expression shifting from smug amusement to something colder, more threatening. "You really think some phone call is going to save you?" he growled. "You think you're the only one who can make calls, girl?" Jamie's eyes flicked up, meeting his cold stare, and for a moment, she felt a surge of anger. She wasn't about to let these men terrorize her any longer. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice gaining strength, though her heart was still racing. The words were clear, decisive, and she meant them. For a split second, the leader seemed taken aback by her unyielding response. Then, a dark smile crept across his face. He was used to breaking people, bending them to his will. But something in Jamie's gaze made him pause. Perhaps he didn't fully understand who she was, or how far she was willing to go to protect her father. But whatever it was, it didn't last long. The moment of hesitation passed, and with a swift motion, the leader reached for his belt, his fingers brushing the handle of a weapon. Jamie's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was escalating fast. Just as the tension in the diner reached its peak, the bell over the door chimed, signaling someone's arrival. Everyone turned toward the door. The biker's eyes narrowed, confused by the sudden interruption. Jamie took a deep breath, trying to center herself, and in that brief moment, she caught a glimpse of someone she never expected to see, Ben. He didn't come in through the front entrance, but rather, through the back. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as he made his way toward the bikers without saying a word. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. And when he acted, people knew something was about to change. The bikers didn't know who Ben was. But Jamie did. And in that instant, she felt a spark of hope light within her. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this. Ben's eyes locked onto the leader, the biker who had been tormenting Jamie. Without a word, he moved closer, his presence filling the room with a quiet intensity. The tension thickened, and the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. The bikers sensed that they were no longer in control. The leader stood straighter, his gaze flicking between Jamie and Ben. His fingers tightened around the weapon at his side. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Ben didn't flinch. He simply took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm the man who's going to make sure you regret ever coming here," he said, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable threat. Jamie's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The moment she had been hoping for, the moment where everything changed. But even as the bikers seemed to hesitate, she knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much left to uncover. The phone call she'd made wasn't just about reaching out for help, it had set off a chain of events that was about to spiral into something far bigger than either she or Ben could have anticipated. The care home. The bikers. Her father. It was all connected, all part of something far darker than she could have ever imagined. As the room held its breath, Jamie felt the weight of what was at stake pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her father's safety anymore. She was fighting for something deeper, for justice, for retribution, and for the truth that had been buried for far too long. Would Ben be able to take down the bikers, or was this just a small victory before a larger battle unfolded? And as the confrontation escalated, would they uncover the full extent of the danger that had been lurking in the shadows all along? The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. But as the bikers shifted, ready to make their move, Jamie couldn't help but wonder if she was about to walk into a trap, one that would change everything. The tension in the diner was palpable, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. Ben stood in the back, unwavering, as the leader of the biker gang sized him up, trying to figure out who this newcomer was and how much of a threat he posed. Ben wasn't a large man, but there was a strength to him that couldn't be denied. His years in the military had molded him into someone who could remain calm under pressure, someone who could face danger without blinking an eye. The bikers could sense that. And it scared them. The leader looked from Ben to Jamie, his eyes narrowing. "You brought this guy here to protect you," he sneered. "You think that's gonna make a difference?" Ben's lips twitched into a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not here to protect anyone," he said quietly. "I'm here to make sure you don't hurt anyone else." The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men stared each other down. Jamie, still clutching her phone, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She was caught in the middle of something far bigger than she had expected. The bikers had come for her father, but she now knew it wasn't just a random act of violence. They were here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was personal. Her thoughts flashed back to her father, sitting alone in his room at the care home. Ever since he had been blinded during his time in service, life had become a quiet existence for him. He had always tried to shield her from the darker aspects of his past, but Jamie had heard enough over the years to know that there were things he wasn't telling her. The bikers, the tension, the sudden phone call from the care home, this all seemed too coincidental. Her father had never spoken of the bikers directly, but Jamie had overheard conversations when she was younger. People in town whispered about a debt he owed, a blood feud that had festered over the years. She didn't know the details, and she didn't want to know, but as she sat there in the diner, she could feel the weight of those unsaid words pressing down on her. Something had happened all those years ago that had shaped her father's life in ways she couldn't yet understand. And now, it was finally coming to collect. Ben stepped forward, his presence somehow making the bikers uneasy. The leader took a half step back, eyes darting around, sensing the change in the air. He wasn't used to being challenged. These were the kind of men who took what they wanted, who made the rules, and who expected to be obeyed. But Ben wasn't afraid. There was something about him, something that screamed that he had seen things far worse than a biker gang. Something about him told the leader that this wasn't a fight they were going to win. Jamie looked at Ben, trying to communicate without words. She knew he was ready, but she wasn't sure what he was planning. Was he going to fight? Or was he buying time? Either way, it was clear that the situation was growing more dangerous by the second. She didn't want to drag Ben into her family's mess, but now that he was here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. "I don't know what you think you're going to do here," the leader spat, his voice filled with venom. "But you better make it quick, because we're not walking out of here empty-handed." Jamie's grip on her phone tightened. She had to think fast. She couldn't let this turn into a full-blown confrontation. Her father had always told her that violence was never the answer, that there were always other ways to resolve conflict. But in this moment, it felt like she was running out of options. She didn't know who to trust, or where to turn. The door to the diner swung open again, and the bell jingled. Another man stepped inside, but this time, it wasn't one of the bikers. It was someone Jamie recognized, someone she hadn't seen in years. It was her father's old friend, Tom. Tom was a man in his early 60s, with a rugged look about him. He was the kind of person who didn't have to speak loudly to command attention. His reputation in the town preceded him, especially among the people who had known her father. Tom had been part of the same unit as her dad during their time in the military, but after they left service, their paths had diverged. While her father had become quiet and withdrawn, Tom had remained active, involved in the town's affairs and, as some whispered, in things that were far more dangerous. Jamie's eyes widened in shock. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Tom's gaze locked onto the bikers, and for a moment, there was an unsettling calm in his eyes. "I think it's time we settled some old scores," he said quietly, his voice low but with an authority that seemed to make even the bikers hesitate. The leader of the bikers sneered. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" "I'm someone who knows things," Tom said, his tone cold. "Things you'd rather not have me talk about." Jamie's mind raced. She had never known Tom to be a man of secrets, but there was something about the way he spoke now that made her question everything. What had her father been involved in all those years ago? And what did Tom know that could change everything? The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the tension building once again. It was clear they were no longer in control of the situation. Ben remained in place, his stance unwavering, but he was watching Tom closely, trying to read him. Jamie's heart was pounding. She felt like she was trapped in the middle of a chess game, where each move seemed to carry enormous consequences. The leader of the bikers stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Tom. "You're gonna wish you hadn't come here, old man," he growled. But Tom didn't flinch. He just took a step toward him, unafraid. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said softly, almost like a warning. Jamie's mind spun. What was going on? Who was Tom really, and what had her father gotten entangled in? She could feel the weight of her family's past pressing down on her, and the secrets she'd never known were slowly coming to light. As the standoff continued, Jamie's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, her stomach churning. It was another call from the care home. "Hello," she answered quickly, her voice tight. "Jamie," the nurse said, her voice cracking. "You need to come. It's your father, something's happened. He's not responding. You have to hurry." The words sent a cold shiver down Jamie's spine. She didn't know if it was the bikers, Tom, or something else entirely, but everything was falling apart. The danger her father had been running from all these years was now closing in on her, and there was no way out. Her heart raced. She had to make a decision. She had to get to the care home, but how could she leave now, with so much hanging in the balance? Would Ben and Tom be enough to stop the bikers? Or was this only the beginning of a much darker story that would change everything? The buzz of her phone in her hand was like an electric shock, and for a moment, Jamie froze, her heart racing as the nurse's voice echoed in her ears. Her father was in trouble. Whatever was happening at the care home, it wasn't just a simple accident. The urgency in the nurse's voice made it clear that things were escalating, and Jamie didn't have much time. But as she stood there, torn between the need to rush to her father's side and the fear that the bikers might make a move if she left, she realized she couldn't make this decision alone. She glanced at Ben, his expression unreadable, his posture still tense but controlled. She could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. He wasn't about to let her go into this fight without backup, but there was a silent understanding between them. He wasn't just here to protect her, he was here to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might get. Then her gaze shifted to Tom. The shock of seeing him walk in had yet to wear off. There were so many questions she needed to ask, but the silence between them was deafening. Tom wasn't just any old acquaintance, he was someone her father had trusted. And his presence here, now, with the bikers closing in, wasn't just coincidental. Jamie could feel the weight of the years that had passed between her father and Tom. The history that they shared had suddenly become far more relevant. "Tom," Jamie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's really going on here? What do you know about all of this?" Tom didn't look at her right away. Instead, he kept his eyes on the bikers, his gaze calculating. The leader of the gang was still seething, his hands twitching by his sides, as if waiting for the signal to move. He clearly wasn't intimidated by Tom, but that wasn't what Jamie needed to focus on right now. Tom finally turned his head, his expression serious, but his tone remained calm. "Your father's past isn't as quiet as you think, Jamie. The bikers aren't just some random troublemakers. They've been waiting for years. And now, they think they've got their chance to settle an old score. I'm here because it's my responsibility to make sure they don't get away with it." The words hung in the air between them. Jamie's heart pounded as she processed what Tom was saying. Her father had never shared the details, but he had always hinted that he was involved in something dangerous. Something that was now haunting them both. But what was it? Why had Tom been the one to show up now? Why hadn't he come sooner? Ben, sensing the shift in the conversation, stepped closer to Jamie. "What does he mean?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "What's really going on with your father?" Jamie looked between Ben and Tom. Her head spun. She had always known there was more to her father's past than he had let on, but hearing it from Tom made it all too real. Whatever it was, it had come back to claim its due, and now, it was dragging her into the middle of it. "Don't you think I don't know that?" she shot back, her voice trembling with frustration. "I don't have all the answers, Ben. But I know my father, and whatever's going on, it's connected to these bikers. They're not just here to scare me. They've been waiting for something." Tom's eyes softened slightly. "You're right. They've been waiting for a long time, Jamie. And now, it seems they've found the opening they've been looking for." He paused, then added quietly, "But this isn't just about your father. It's about a promise that was made, a debt that was never repaid. And now, the cost is coming due." Jamie felt a cold chill crawl up her spine. A promise? A debt? She had no idea what Tom was referring to, but the way he spoke made it clear that whatever it wasn't something she could easily walk away from. The bikers weren't just angry at her father, they were looking to settle something that had festered for years, something darker than she could have imagined. Ben leaned in closer, his voice barely audible. "Jamie, you have to decide. We can't stand here and do nothing. Those bikers are waiting for you to make a move, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Jamie looked down at her phone, her fingers trembling as she stared at the missed call from the care home. Her father needed her. But how could she leave now? What if she walked straight into the trap the bikers had set for her? What if this was the moment they had been waiting for, to take everything from her? Her mind was racing as she tried to piece together the puzzle. There was too much she didn't know. Too many unanswered questions. What exactly had her father been involved in all those years ago? Who had these bikers been to him? And why did Tom seem to know so much, yet remain so distant? "Tom, I don't understand," Jamie said, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you come sooner? Why didn't you help my father before this?" Tom's gaze softened, but his expression was still troubled. "I wasn't the right person to help him then. I couldn't be." But now, he looked back at the bikers, his jaw clenched. "Now, it's too late to turn back. I came because I owe your father more than I can ever repay. And I'll be damned if I let these punks get away with what they're planning." The bikers were still watching them, their leader's eyes darting back and forth between the group. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and Jamie knew time was running out. She had to make a decision, and fast. "I can't just sit here," she said suddenly, her voice strong despite the fear that gripped her. "I have to go to the care home. I don't care what happens. I won't let them hurt my father." Ben and Tom exchanged a glance, both of them sensing the same thing. This wasn't just about saving her father anymore. It was about facing the consequences of a past that had been buried too long. And Jamie knew that whatever she walked into at the care home, it was going to change everything. Tom moved toward the door, his expression set. "Then we're going with you." Ben stepped beside her, his presence reassuring. "I'm with you, Jamie. Let's get through this together." As Jamie looked between the two men, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this fight. Whatever the bikers were planning, she would face it head-on, with the truth, her father's legacy, and the people she trusted by her side. But as they turned to leave the diner, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle hadn't even begun. Whatever was waiting for her at the care home, it was only the beginning of a much darker, more dangerous story. And she had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole went. The door swung open, and as they stepped into the cold night air, Jamie felt the weight of her past and future collide. There was no turning back now. The night air outside the diner was colder than Jamie had anticipated, the chill biting at her skin as she stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. The weight of everything, the bikers, the phone call from the care home, Tom's cryptic words, pressed down on her chest. She had to get to the care home, but each step she took felt heavier than the last. The unknown loomed ahead like an insurmountable wall, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap. Ben fell into step beside her, his presence grounding, though there was a sense of urgency in the way he moved. He didn't ask questions, didn't push her to explain anything further. He just knew that they had to act, that the silence between them was better than speaking right now. Tom led the way, his footsteps deliberate and steady, as if he had been down this road 1,000 times before. There was a quiet intensity in his movements, like a man who had seen too much, done too much, to be rattled by what was coming. But Jamie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Tom knew more than he was saying. She needed answers, answers about her father, about the bikers, and about the years of secrets that had built up like a dam, just waiting to break. As they reached Tom's truck, the engine's low rumble felt oddly comforting, as if it offered some kind of assurance that they weren't completely alone in this. But as the doors slammed shut behind them, Jamie knew that the silence within the truck was the calm before the storm. They were headed toward the care home, and nothing about this night felt safe. "Are you going to tell me what's really going on, Tom?" Jamie asked, her voice a mix of frustration and desperation. Tom's hands tightened on the wheel as they drove through the dark streets, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. "I can't tell you everything, Jamie," he said, his voice heavy. "Your father's past is his to reveal, not mine. But I will tell you this, what's coming, it's been years in the making. The bikers, they've been waiting for him to slip up. They think they have leverage. Now, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Jamie's stomach twisted at the thought. Leverage? What could they possibly want from him now? "He's been in a care home for years. You don't know the full story," Tom cut in. "Your father. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something bigger, something that's come back to haunt him now. Those bikers are just the tip of the iceberg. There are people, much worse than them, who've been looking for something. And your father, he made enemies he couldn't outrun." Jamie's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known there was more to her father's past, but hearing Tom speak of it so darkly made everything feel real in a way she wasn't ready for. She wanted to argue, to dismiss his words as paranoid ramblings, but deep down, she knew they weren't. The bikers weren't just random criminals. They were a part of something much larger, something connected to her father's military past. Ben glanced out the window, his jaw tight. He had stayed quiet through the conversation, but the tension in his posture told Jamie that he was processing everything just as deeply as she was. "Tom," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but with an edge of concern, "if your story is true, then why are we still walking into this blindly? Why aren't we getting more answers before we get to the care home?" Tom's eyes flicked to Ben for a brief second before he turned his attention back to the road. "Because we don't have time for answers right now. Those bikers won't wait around. We need to get to your father before they do." The urgency in his voice made it clear that there was more at stake than Jamie had realized. But what could it be? She couldn't stop the questions that flooded her mind, each one more pressing than the last. What exactly had her father been involved in? Why hadn't he told her any of this? And if it was true that there were worse people than the bikers after him, who were they, and why had they waited this long to make a move? As they drove on, the sound of the tires on the gravel road was the only thing filling the heavy silence between them. Jamie couldn't focus on anything else but the images that kept flashing in her mind, the bikers, her father, Tom's warning. She had always thought of her father as a man who had lived a quiet life after the war, a life full of small routines and the kind of peace that came from years of fighting for his country. But now, it seemed his past was coming for him with a vengeance. And no amount of quiet living could shield her from the storm that was finally catching up. Minutes felt like hours, and as the care home finally came into view, the familiar, sterile building felt like a cage closing in on her. Her pulse quickened as she saw the lights flickering in the distance, the darkened windows casting long shadows over the parking lot. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her gut. This wasn't just a random phone call from the nurse. This was part of a larger plan, and she had no idea how deep it went. Tom pulled into the lot, his truck crunching over the gravel as he came to a stop. He didn't turn off the engine right away. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his eyes narrowed. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "I can feel it." Jamie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Who's here?" Tom finally turned to face her, his expression grim. "The bikers, Jamie. They've followed us. And they're not leaving until they get what they want." Ben shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the parking lot. "We need to make a plan." "No," Tom said, his tone firm. "There's no time for a plan. We need to get to your father, now." Jamie's heart was racing. She didn't know if she was more afraid of what was coming or what they were about to walk into. Her father had always been a man of strength, someone who could handle anything life threw his way. But now, with the shadows closing in around them, she couldn't help but wonder if they had waited too long to uncover the truth. As they stepped out of the truck, Jamie felt the weight of every moment pushing down on her. The care home, once a place of quiet and safety, now felt like the last place she wanted to be. The doors loomed ahead, cold and impersonal, and as she moved toward them, she couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was about to unfold. Whatever secrets her father had buried in his past, whatever debt had gone unpaid, were about to rise to the surface, and she would have to face them head-on. The shadows in the parking lot seemed to stretch further with every step they took. The door to the care home creaked open, and as they entered, Jamie knew that the night was far from over. The real story was only just beginning, and she had no idea how far it would take her, or what it would cost. The hallway inside the care home was eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound breaking the stillness. It smelled of antiseptic and bleach, a sterile environment that had always seemed comforting to Jamie, until tonight. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the bikers to be right behind them, but the parking lot was empty now. The sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance left only a lingering tension in the air. Tom led the way, his body tense as he moved with purpose down the hallway. Ben, walking slightly behind Jamie, had his eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. His hand hovered near his jacket pocket, where Jamie knew he kept a gun for situations like this. She couldn't blame him for being on edge. This night had already proven that nothing was as it seemed. "Where's my dad?" Jamie asked, her voice breaking the silence. She was trying to sound calm, but the fear that had been building inside her was starting to spill over. The phone call from the nurse had been vague, but the urgency had been undeniable. Something was wrong. And now that she was here, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was worse than she'd imagined. "Room 305, the nurse had told her on the phone. "But please hurry. I don't know how much longer we can keep him safe." The nurse's words echoed in her mind as they walked past closed doors, the soft shuffle of their footsteps the only sound in the quiet halls. The care home, usually a place where the elderly were tended to in peace, now felt like a battlefield. She could sense something lingering in the air, an invisible presence, like the calm before a storm. Tom stopped in front of a door halfway down the hall. He didn't knock. Just pushed it open, his face set in grim determination. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a nightlight casting shadows across the floor. Her father's bed was to the left, the blanket pulled up to his chest. Jamie's heart skipped a beat as she saw the figure lying there, her father, still and unmoving, his breathing shallow. But there was something else. Something Jamie hadn't expected. Standing next to the bed, a figure cloaked in shadow, was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a hood pulled low over his face, hiding his features. The figure was motionless, but the atmosphere in the room shifted as soon as they entered. The air felt colder, denser, as if the presence of this man had brought a chill that reached into Jamie's bones. Ben's hand went to his pocket again, but Tom put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Not yet," he whispered. Jamie's voice trembled as she stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his eyes gleaming from beneath the hood. His gaze was cold, calculating, and for a moment, Jamie thought she recognized something in the way he looked at her. Something familiar. But it was impossible. She didn't know anyone who looked like him. Tom stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. "Leave him be." The man didn't react. He just stared at them, his eyes calculating, as if weighing his options. Jamie felt a knot form in her stomach, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. There was no mistaking it. This man wasn't here for her father's care. He was here for something else. "Who sent you?" Jamie demanded, trying to steady her voice despite the fear bubbling up inside her. "What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Your father owes a debt," he said, his voice smooth, like a snake's hiss. "And I'm here to collect." Jamie's heart sank as the words settled in. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just some random thug looking to take advantage of her father's vulnerability. This was part of something bigger, something her father had been running from for years. The bikers, the cryptic warnings, the debts that had gone unpaid, it was all connected. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving the man's face. "What do you mean, a debt?" "My father hasn't been involved with anyone for years." The man didn't respond immediately. He glanced down at her father, who remained motionless on the bed. "Your father has been hiding for a long time, Mississippi. But it's time for him to pay what he owes." Jamie's mind raced. What could her father have done that would lead to this? What kind of people were involved? And why had they waited until now to collect? The man's gaze shifted from Jamie to Tom, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You," he said softly, his tone barely more than a whisper, but the weight behind the word was undeniable. "You should have stayed away, Tom." Tom's jaw tightened, his hand twitching by his side. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice controlled but laced with anger. "Oh, I know more than you think." The man's smile widened, a cruel, knowing expression that sent a chill down Jamie's spine. "I know all about your little promise. About how you thought you could keep running. But you're not running anymore, are you?" The words hit like a slap, and Jamie's confusion deepened. What promise? What was this man talking about? Tom, who had always seemed so reliable, so composed, was now standing in front of a stranger who knew things about his past, things Jamie couldn't even begin to understand. Ben stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said. "You need to leave now, before things get worse." But the man didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at them, the tension in the room so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again. "I'll leave," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "But don't think this is over. Your father's debt is only part of the story. And soon, miss, you'll find out exactly what he's been hiding. We'll be back." With that, the man turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow but deliberate. But just as he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back at Jamie with a cold, unsettling smile. "You don't know how deep this goes," he said softly. But you will. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jamie standing there, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The room felt even colder now, the weight of the man's words pressing down on her like an unseen hand. She had come here to protect her father, to find out what was wrong. But all she had done was uncover more questions, more mysteries, mysteries that now threatened not only her father's life, but her own. What the hell was that? Ben whispered, his voice shaky for the first time that night. I don't know, Jamie replied, her voice barely audible. But I'm going to find out. And as she looked at her father, still unconscious in his bed, she realized that whatever was waiting for them out there, it was just the beginning. The real danger hadn't even shown itself yet. The door clicked shut behind the man, and for a moment, everything was still. The air felt too thick to breathe, and the silence pressed down on Jamie's chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on the spot where the figure had just been, her mind struggling to make sense of the words he had left hanging in the air. Her father's debt? A promise? What was all of this really about? Ben was the first to move. His hand dropped from his jacket pocket, and he turned to Tom, his face tight with frustration. You knew him, didn't you? That man, he knew you. Tom didn't answer right away. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if expecting the stranger to return. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost in the quiet. I don't know him, he said, though his tone didn't convince anyone, especially not Jamie. Not directly. But he's part of something I've been running from for a long time. Something connected to your father. Jamie's heart raced. The weight of those words felt suffocating. What did Tom know? And why was he hiding it from her? Running from? Ben asked, clearly suspicious. You mean hiding? Tom shot him a look, his expression hardening. It's not the same thing. I was trying to keep people safe. The tension in the room thickened. Jamie could feel it wrapping itself around her, pulling her deeper into a web of confusion and fear she wasn't ready for. What are you talking about, Tom? She finally demanded. What's really going on? My dad, he's been in that bed for years, too sick to do anything. There's no way he's involved in anything now. Tom ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling. He turned toward her, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. Your father got mixed up with some dangerous people, Jamie. People who don't care about what happens to anyone else. I was trying to keep him out of it, trying to keep you out of it. But now, he paused, glancing toward the door, his voice dropping to a whisper. Now, it's too late. Jamie's breath hitched in her throat. What do you mean, too late? Before Tom could respond, there was a sudden, loud knock on the door. The sound startled all of them, a jarring intrusion in the already tense atmosphere. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened. Don't answer it, Ben said immediately, his voice sharp with urgency. They're not done with us. We need to leave. But Jamie couldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the door, her mind racing. The man, whoever he was, had made it clear they weren't just dealing with bikers anymore. There were worse people involved. The debt her father owed, it was connected to something bigger. Something dangerous. And now, they were here. The knock sounded again, more forceful this time. Tom gave a small nod, and without another word, he stepped toward the door, his movements deliberate. Stay here, he ordered. Jamie watched him with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Why was he going to face whatever was out there alone? Couldn't he see how dangerous this was? Tom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do this. We can call the police, get help. No, he cut her off, his voice firm. There's no time. Trust me. I'll handle this. He reached for the doorknob, but before he could open it, the door burst inward with a violent force. Jamie gasped, stumbling backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Standing in the doorway, a tall figure with dark sunglasses and a leather jacket, was another biker, his presence almost overwhelming in its intensity. Behind him, she could just make out the shadowy outlines of two more figures, all of them larger than life, their eyes burning with an unmistakable menace. The biker at the front stepped inside, his boots heavy against the floor as he moved closer. "We're here for the man who owes us," he growled, his voice thick with malice. Jamie's stomach twisted. The feeling of imminent danger was suffocating, a palpable threat that seemed to suffuse every inch of the room. Tom stood his ground, his expression unflinching, but Jamie could see the tension in his shoulders. He was prepared for this, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. "What do you want with him?" Tom asked, his voice tight with restraint. The biker smiled, a cruel and twisted expression that made Jamie's blood run cold. "We want him to pay." "And you, Tom," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you've been running from this for too long. You think you can protect people? You're just as guilty as he is." Ben moved slightly behind Jamie, his hand close to his gun. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment settling like a heavy fog. They were surrounded, trapped in this room with no clear way out. "You should have stayed out of this, Tom," the biker continued, taking a step forward. "But now, you've dragged her into it. This is where it ends." The words cut through the room like a knife, and Jamie's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? What had Tom dragged her into? But before she could ask, the second biker stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of a knife strapped to his belt. "We gave your father a chance to make things right. But it's over now," he said, his tone dark and final. Tom didn't flinch, but Jamie could see the way his jaw clenched. He knew that words wouldn't stop these men. He knew this was a confrontation they couldn't avoid. "Listen to me," Tom said, his voice calm despite the growing tension. "You don't have to do this. I can get the money. I can make this right. Just give me time." The lead biker laughed, the sound chilling. "Time? Your father's had enough time. We're done here." The air felt charged with violence now, and Jamie knew they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She didn't know how this was going to end, but one thing was clear: whatever was about to happen would change everything. For her father. For Tom. And for herself. In that moment, as the bikers took another step forward, Jamie realized that the fight was no longer just about her father's past. It was about survival. And she wasn't sure they could survive this. With the bikers closing in, Jamie could feel the weight of their gaze on her. Every breath felt like it was being stolen from her as she searched for a way out, her mind racing for any possibility. She couldn't let them win. Not now. Not when they were this close. But as the tension mounted, and the bikers' heavy boots echoed through the room, Jamie realized she didn't know if anyone could escape the storm that was about to break. The real battle was just beginning, and the cost of it could be higher than anything she was prepared for. The room seemed to shrink with every passing second. Jamie could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, drowning out everything else. The bikers were closing in, their shadows looming like dark clouds, and she felt the pressure building with every step they took. There was no way out, no easy solution. Her mind was racing, scrambling for anything at all, that could stop what was coming. Tom's eyes flickered toward her, his gaze meeting hers for a brief, fleeting moment. There was a mixture of regret and determination in his expression. Whatever he had been hiding, whatever connection he had to these people, now it was all coming to light, and there was no turning back. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm but strained, as if he knew just how fragile the situation had become. Jamie barely nodded, her breath shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't want to hide. She didn't want to cower. But she didn't know what else to do. The bikers were still moving closer, their boots tapping on the floor with an ominous rhythm that echoed through the room. The knife at the second biker's side glinted in the dim light, catching her eye, and she couldn't help but shiver. "You really think this is going to end any differently than it did last time?" the lead biker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're going to talk your way out of this, Tom?" Tom's hands were clenched at his sides, his face hardening, but he didn't respond immediately. His silence spoke volumes. The past was weighing heavily on him, and Jamie could see it in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his shoulders tensed. There were no easy words to say now, no bargaining to be done. This was a reckoning, a point of no return. Jamie's mind flicked back to the words the stranger had said when he first arrived. Asterisk, your father owes a debt. Asterisk, the pieces were starting to fall into place, but even as they did, she wasn't sure she wanted to understand the full picture. Her father had been hiding from people like this for years. People who wouldn't hesitate to burn everything down to collect. But why had it come to this now? Why were they targeting her, dragging her into this mess? The second biker, taller and more menacing than the first, took another step forward. He reached down and unstrapped the knife from his belt, letting the blade catch the light as it glimmered ominously. "You're out of options, Tom," he growled. "This time, you won't be able to run. You're not getting away from us." Jamie felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. The threat was palpable, hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. It was happening. This wasn't some bad dream she could wake up from. This was real. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Please," Jamie said, her voice shaky, almost pleading. She stepped forward, desperation creeping into her words. "Please, don't hurt him. He's not the person you think he is." The lead biker's lips twisted into a grin, cruel and cold. He turned to look at her, sizing her up like a predator eyeing its prey. "Oh, we know exactly who he is," he said, his voice low and full of menace. "And we know all about your little secret, too." Jamie froze. Her stomach lurched as his words hit her like a punch to the gut. What secret? What was he talking about? The confusion was written all over her face, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. "Leave her out of this," Tom growled, stepping forward to shield her. His eyes were locked on the bikers now, his fists clenched, ready for a fight. But the second biker laughed, the sound of it low and dark. "She's already part of it now," he said, his tone mocking. "You brought her into this mess the moment you brought her here." Jamie's mind was reeling. They were talking about her, like she was part of the deal. She couldn't understand. She was just here because her father had been in trouble, not because she had any connection to whatever debt they were talking about. But the more the bikers spoke, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about everything. About everything her family had hidden for so long. Tom's face twisted in frustration. "You've made your point," he said through gritted teeth. "But if you think for a second that you're going to get away with this," the lead biker raised his hand, cutting him off. "Oh, we're not done, Tom. You're just the beginning. We're here to make sure everything gets settled once and for all." He paused, his gaze shifting to Jamie. "And you, sweetie, you're just the collateral damage." The words hit her like a slap, and her blood ran cold. She had never been part of any deal. She had never asked for this. She was just trying to get answers, just trying to protect her father. But now it was clear, there was no escaping the nightmare they were all trapped in. She needed to do something. Anything. But what? She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to the small table in the corner where her father's personal effects were scattered. And then it hit her, a phone. She had one last chance. The thought was fleeting, but as the bikers closed in, she knew there was only one option left. Her hand shot out, grabbing the phone from the table. Without thinking, she dialed the number she knew by heart. Her finger trembling as she pressed the call button. The phone rang twice, and then, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, calm. It was the one person she trusted above all others. It was the person who could help. "Ben," she whispered, barely able to hold the phone steady. "We need help. Now." The bikers hadn't noticed yet, too busy moving toward Tom, who was standing like a wall between them and Jamie. The tension in the room was so thick, Jamie couldn't breathe. But as Ben's voice crackled through the phone, she knew that her call had set something in motion. "I'm on my way." Ben's voice was low, firm. "Don't do anything stupid. Hold tight." With that, the line went dead. Jamie shoved the phone back into her pocket. She could feel the cold weight of fear in her chest, but there was no turning back now. It was all or nothing. She had made her choice. Whatever happened next, it was up to her and Tom to stand their ground. The lead biker moved even closer, his hands flexing, a look of cold satisfaction on his face. "We'll see how long you can last, Tom," he sneered. "This is where your little story ends." But before Jamie could take another breath, something changed. There was a sound, a low rumble, like the growl of an engine in the distance. The tension in the air tightened as the noise grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. It was Ben. He was coming. But the question was, would they be in time? The rumble of the engine grew louder, reverberating through the room as if it were a distant storm rolling in. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but now there was a new hope rising. Ben was on his way. For a moment, the bikers seemed to pause, their attention momentarily diverted by the sound of the approaching vehicle. Tom's gaze flickered toward the door, his expression unreadable, but his stance shifted ever so slightly, preparing for whatever was coming next. But then, just as quickly as the hope had appeared, something unexpected happened. The door to the diner, already partially broken in, was kicked open with brutal force. In an instant, the room fell deathly silent as a new figure appeared in the doorway, blocking the light from outside with his imposing presence. It wasn't Ben. The figure was tall, with dark sunglasses that masked his eyes. A long leather coat swirled behind him as he stepped forward, his boots clicking with authority on the floor. Behind him, the rumble of the engine outside faded, replaced by a sudden screech of tires and the distinct sound of a second vehicle skidding to a stop. It wasn't just Ben's bike anymore. Jamie's blood ran cold. This was something else entirely. The man in the doorway didn't speak at first, but his mere presence commanded attention. There was a quiet menace in the way he stood, as if he were the calm before a violent storm. The bikers, who had been so focused on Tom and Jamie, now shifted their attention to this new player, their eyes narrowing in confusion and suspicion. Tom's posture stiffened, his muscles visibly tightening as if he recognized this new arrival, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the man who had just walked into their lives like an uninvited shadow. "Who the hell are you?" the lead biker finally growled, taking a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. The man in the doorway didn't flinch. His lips curled into a faint, almost amused smile as he removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were sharp and calculating. "Someone who's been looking for all of you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "And someone who doesn't take kindly to interruptions." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air was waiting for someone to make the next move. Jamie's mind raced. She had no idea who this man was, but the way he spoke, the way the bikers reacted to him, it was clear that his arrival had shifted everything. The bikers, who had been ready to tear into Tom, were suddenly on edge. It was as if they were no longer in control of the situation. Something had changed, and Jamie wasn't sure whether it was a blessing or a curse. The second biker, the one with the knife, tensed, his fingers twitching near the handle, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he glanced at the man in the doorway with a mix of wariness and something else, something that looked like fear. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, barely above a whisper. The man's smile only deepened. "I don't care what's supposed to be. I'm here now." Jamie's stomach twisted as she watched the unfolding scene. The bikers had been threatening her, threatening Tom, but now they were looking at the new arrival like they had just realized they might be out of their depth. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and the entire power dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant. Tom's eyes flicked toward Jamie, his face filled with both warning and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. "Stay back," he whispered, his voice urgent. But it wasn't fear that she heard, it was something else. He wasn't afraid of the bikers. He was afraid of this new figure. Before Jamie could react, the man in the doorway took a step forward, and the bikers instinctively took a half step back, visibly uncomfortable with the new arrival's presence. The tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was the moment everything could go sideways, and Jamie was caught in the middle. "Tom," the man said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "You've been running for too long. It's time to pay up." Jamie's breath hitched. Pay up? What did that mean? Who was this man to Tom? And why was he so determined to confront him? Tom's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "I don't owe you anything," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "I did what you asked. I stayed out of it." The man's smile didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. "You should have stayed gone," he said. "You never should have come back to this place. But now, well, now, it's too late for apologies." Jamie's mind was spinning. This was bigger than she had realized. The debt her father owed, it wasn't just about bikers or money anymore. This man, this imposing figure, seemed to have control over everything. And he wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to play games. "Who are you?" Jamie finally found her voice, her words shaky but loud enough to break the tense silence. The man turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. It wasn't kindness, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her blood run even colder. "Someone who's been watching all of you," he said cryptically, his tone cold. "And someone who's been waiting for the right moment." The second biker, still on edge, exchanged a look with the others. Something was off. This man wasn't just a random player in their game. He was a part of something bigger. Jamie felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that no matter what happened next, this was the moment everything changed. "Enough talking," the lead biker snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. He reached for his own weapon, a steel pipe, ready to escalate things. "We're here for a reason, and we're not leaving without what we came for." But before anyone could make another move, a loud, familiar engine roared outside. The sound of Ben's bike was unmistakable, and it was closer than ever. But just as the bikers bristled, preparing for another confrontation, the man in the doorway raised his hand in a clear signal to stop. "Not yet," he said with a quiet authority. "Let's see if your friend can handle what's coming next." The tension in the room shot through the roof. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, but Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would decide everything. And then the second plot twist came, one Jamie never saw coming. The man in the doorway wasn't just here to settle debts. He was here to make sure that everyone in the room paid for their sins, and that included her. Her heart raced as she realized the stakes had just been raised. What had she gotten herself into? The room was taut with tension, every second dragging on like an eternity. Jamie could feel the weight of the man's eyes on her, cold and unblinking. The bikers were on edge, waiting for the next move, their hands twitching near weapons, but the new arrival, the man in the doorway, held them at bay. No one was making a move. Not yet. The sound of Ben's motorcycle grew louder, and for a moment, it seemed like the cavalry had arrived. But the man in the doorway didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the noise. He was locked in on Tom, his voice low as he spoke. "I've been waiting for this moment, Tom. For a long time." Jamie's heart pounded in her chest. Who was this man to her father? What had Tom been hiding all these years? The questions spun in her mind, but there was no time to get answers. The situation was escalating. The bikers were shifting, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this new, unforeseen player, but no one seemed to know what to do. "Why don't you just leave?" Jamie found her voice, her words trembling but firm. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" The man turned his gaze to her, and for a moment, Jamie thought she saw something shift in his expression. A flicker of pity, or maybe regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold resolve. "I'm not here to explain myself to you," he said, his voice calm but full of danger. "I'm here to finish what was started." Jamie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. This wasn't just about her father anymore. This was bigger. It was personal. Tom's past had finally caught up with them all, and now, there was no escaping it. Suddenly, the door to the diner flew open with a crash, and Ben's figure appeared in the doorway. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the tension, the threat of violence hanging in the air. Without missing a beat, he stepped forward, his voice loud and commanding. "That's enough." The man in the doorway barely acknowledged him. "You're too late," he said simply, his voice cold. "This was never about you, Ben." The biker shifted uneasily, unsure of what was happening, but Ben wasn't backing down. He had come for one reason, and that was to protect Jamie. He looked at her, his eyes soft but determined, then turned back to face the man in the doorway. "We're done here. Whatever history you have, whatever debt you think is owed, it ends now." For a long moment, there was only silence. Jamie could hear the faint sound of Ben's motorcycle outside, the hum of the engine now joined by the steady click of boots on the diner's floor. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The man's lips twitched into a smile, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand, do you? It's not just about money or revenge. It's about balance." He turned slowly to face the bikers, his eyes calculating. "You think you're the ones in charge here, but you're not. You never were." Ben's gaze never wavered. "If you think you're going to walk out of here and get away with whatever you've done, you're wrong." Without warning, the man moved, his hand shooting out toward Tom. But before anyone could react, a shot rang out, sharp, deafening, splitting the air like thunder. Jamie's breath caught in her throat as the man staggered back, his hand clutching at his chest. The diner fell into a stunned silence. "Who?" Jamie gasped, looking around in confusion. The source of the shot was still unclear, but the man in the doorway was on the ground now, struggling to stay conscious. His once cold gaze was now wide with shock. Tom was the first to move, rushing forward to grab the man by the collar, his face twisted in fury. "You should have stayed out of this," he spat, shaking the man roughly. Then, to Jamie's disbelief, another figure stepped into the room, a figure she never thought she'd see. It was the same woman who had been lurking in the shadows during their previous encounters, the one who had always been a mysterious part of Tom's life, someone Jamie could never quite figure out. She was holding a gun, her eyes cold and focused. "You should have listened, Tom," the woman said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos unfolding. "You've been running from your past for too long. But now it's over." Jamie couldn't process it all at once. The bikers, who had once been the main threat, were now just pawns in this much larger game. Tom had always been running from something, from someone, and this woman, this was the person he had been avoiding. "What the hell is going on?" Jamie shouted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her mind was reeling, but the woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Tom. "You've been in debt to me for years," the woman said, her tone now cold and unforgiving. "And you thought you could just disappear, fade into the background. But debt never really goes away, Tom. It just keeps collecting." Jamie's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The bikers, the threats, the violence, it was all tied to Tom's past. And this woman, this stranger, was the one holding all the cards. She wasn't just part of the problem. She was the heart of it all. Ben stepped forward, his body tense, ready to take action. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her gun toward the bikers who had been so ready to attack moments ago. "Get out of here," she said, her voice firm. "This is over. You're done." The bikers, their faces filled with fear and confusion, didn't hesitate. One by one, they backed out of the diner, leaving the scene behind. No more threats, no more violence. For a brief moment, Jamie thought it was over. But as the door slammed shut behind them, Jamie's world tilted once again. The woman lowered her gun slowly and turned her gaze toward Jamie. "I never wanted this to get messy," she said, her eyes locking with Jamie's. "But your father made a lot of enemies. And sometimes, the past catches up with you." Jamie's mind spun, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The debts, the threats, the violence, it had all been part of a much larger story. A story her father had tried so hard to protect her from. But there was one last twist she hadn't seen coming. The woman smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent a chill down Jamie's spine. "You think this is the end?" the woman asked. "You've got another thing coming." Before Jamie could react, the woman disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jamie standing in the center of the diner, her heart racing. The room was silent, but Jamie knew that this wasn't over. The final piece of the puzzle had just been placed, and now, the real story was about to begin. And as the diner door creaked shut, she realized everything she thought she knew was just the beginning. The diner door slammed shut behind the woman, and for a long moment, Jamie stood frozen, her mind reeling. Her heart pounded in her chest, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in her ears. Ben was beside her now, his hand on her shoulder, his presence grounding her, but she couldn't shake the weight of everything that had just happened. She had thought she understood the situation, the bikers, the threats to her father. But now, with the woman's cryptic words hanging in the air, Jamie felt like the rug had been pulled out from under her. "Are you okay?" Ben asked softly, his voice filled with concern, but Jamie couldn't bring herself to answer right away. Her mind was still scrambling to put together the pieces of the puzzle that had just been shattered. I don't know," Jamie finally whispered. "Who is she? Why did she say that?" Ben's face tightened. He seemed to hesitate before answering, as if weighing how much to tell her. "She's someone from your father's past. Someone he tried to keep you away from. But now..." He trailed off, looking over his shoulder toward the door, as if expecting the woman to come back. Jamie shook her head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over her mind. But what did she mean by all of that? What debt? What history? I don't understand. Ben took a deep breath, his eyes dark with a mixture of sadness and regret. Your father didn't just owe money, Jamie. He was involved in things that went deeper than just bikers or criminal debts. He made a lot of enemies over the years, and not just with people you've seen. He paused, as if weighing whether he should continue, but then he met her gaze, his voice softening. He did things for the wrong people. And when those debts went unpaid, people like her, people who control things from the shadows, come to collect. Jamie's heart dropped. She had always known that her father was a man of secrets. But she had never imagined that those secrets were tied to something so dangerous, so far-reaching. It wasn't just a financial burden. It was a life he had tried to keep her from, a life that had finally caught up with them. Why didn't he tell me? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ben sighed deeply, his eyes filled with regret. He was trying to protect you. He thought if he kept you away from all of this, you'd have a chance at a normal life. But some things can't be outrun. And that woman, he nodded toward the door, she's part of it. One of the people he crossed a long time ago. For a moment, Jamie felt like the world was spinning out of control. She had spent so many years thinking she knew her father, believing the stories he had told her, trusting that he was just a man trying to do right by her. But now, all of that was being torn apart. Her father's past had been darker than she ever realized, and it wasn't something she could simply ignore anymore. What happens now? Jamie asked, her voice trembling. What do we do? Ben gave her a steady look, his expression unwavering. We keep moving forward. We can't change the past, Jamie. But we can control what happens next. That woman is dangerous, but she's not invincible. We'll figure out a way to make sure she doesn't drag you into whatever game she's playing. Jamie nodded, but doubt still gnawed at her. How could she be sure? How could she trust anything she had been told about her father now? The pieces of her life had been upended, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as they neared. Jamie glanced out the diner window, her heart sinking as the red and blue lights reflected off the glass. It was over. The bikers had fled, but the police were coming. The aftermath of the chaos was about to unfold, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. We need to go, Ben said quickly, his voice urgent. The last thing we need is to get caught up in this mess with the cops. Come on. Jamie nodded, her legs feeling like lead as she followed him out of the diner. The cool night air hit her like a shock to her system, but it did little to clear the haze in her mind. Ben led her to his motorcycle, and she climbed on without a word, her body tense as the engine roared to life beneath them. She held onto him tightly as they sped away, the sound of the sirens fading into the distance. As they drove, Jamie's mind couldn't stop racing. She thought about the woman's words. About her father's secrets. About everything she had thought she knew. The world she had been living in was no longer the one she understood, and every step she took now felt uncertain. Ben turned his head slightly as they reached an intersection, his eyes scanning the empty road. You're safe now, he said, but there was something in his tone that told Jamie he wasn't sure about that either. Safe, Jamie echoed, but it didn't feel that way. The shadows from the past were still looming over her, and no matter how far she ran, they seemed to be closing in. After a few miles of silence, Jamie's thoughts started to settle a bit. There was still so much to figure out, so many questions that remained unanswered. But one thing was clear, her father's legacy was not just about the man he had been to her. It was about everything he had done before she even knew him. And that past was more than she could have ever imagined. They drove for what felt like hours, the lights of the town fading into the rearview mirror. Eventually, Ben slowed down, bringing the motorcycle to a stop at the edge of a quiet lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. Ben turned off the engine, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Finally, he turned to Jamie, his expression serious but soft. "I know this is a lot to take in. But you're not alone in this, Jamie. I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." Jamie took a deep breath, looking out at the water. The night was peaceful, but her mind was still racing. The future felt uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Whatever happened next, she was going to have to face it head-on. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption, for both her father's past and her own future. As the cool breeze brushed against her face, Jamie finally allowed herself to believe that things could get better. But she also knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. There were still enemies to face, secrets to uncover, and battles to fight. And with that realization, the night seemed to stretch out before her, full of possibilities, but also uncertainty. For the first time, Jamie understood the weight of her father's choices, and the burden she now carried. But she wasn't running anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next.